Hello and welcome to Mint and Burn, the academic analysis of blockchain and other technologies in the decentralized digital economy. I'm your host, Kelsey Nabin, and we are tuning in remotely from the RMIT University Blockchain Innovation Hub to bring you interesting guests, publications, and experts to test frontier ideas in these critical and emerging industries. This is episode number 3 of Mint and Burn, and today we will be talking to Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics Kevin Werbach from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, along with resident expert Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University on blockchain governance and ethics. So welcome to each of you. Thanks for joining us. So diving straight in, Kevin, your headline book, which we were just reading the reviews, which say it's a revelation, talk about blockchain as a new architecture of trust. So in broad terms, what are the key kind of potentials of blockchain as a technology and risks as it relates to trust?
There is this notion you hear from many people in the blockchain and cryptocurrency world that this technology is the end of trust, that it's somehow replacing the problematic human notion of trust with code, with cryptography, and with algorithms. And I think that's wrong. I think actually blockchain is all about trust. It's a new form of trust. It's a different kind of trust. It's a decentralized trust. And in the book, I go through different structures of trust, what I call architectures of trust, that exist today. And trust is tremendously important to business and to society. But all of the conventional structures of trust still require some reliance on a third party. And what blockchain does is it decentralizes that. It still requires trust. You have to trust the blockchain system in various ways, and standing behind the blockchain system are people in many places. But there's no one entity where you have to say, I have to trust, for example, the bank or the government for that particular function. And so that really changes the dynamics. It opens up a huge space of opportunity, creates huge problems as well. And basically, what I talk about is that there are many situations where trust is a problem, where a trusted actor may be a bad actor or may have too much power. We all trust Facebook with all of our data, but it's not because we all think Facebook is perfect and wonderful. It's because we don't feel like we have a choice. But there's all sorts of problems that come up when they have so much power. So we can decentralize trust away from those powerful entities. And then there are many situations where there's a trust gap, where the lack of trust actually prevents things from happening. And we see this a lot in business situations, things like supply chains. I mean, supply chains are, a many trillion-dollar set of industries across the world. And because everyone doesn't trust each other, they don't share information. So you could have 5 or 10 different actors duplicating the same set of records about some goods that are getting shipped across the world on a container ship. And so there's massive inefficiencies and problems with that trust gap. And so blockchain, by potentially creating this new kind of trust, which is not centralized in the same way, can jump that gap and can create lots of incredible new opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting tension about how you navigate that interplay between blockchain and the law, and also kind of existing systems and new systems. I should just point out that both of you mentioned control of keys, which is obviously the cryptographic keys that give you kind of ownership of an account, if anyone is wondering what that is. I do want to get into some of those kind of real world cases, because I know you're quite involved on a number of fronts in how blockchain is sort of manifesting in different levels. But first, I'm curious about how you're seeing, I guess, the software development community or other stakeholders go about designing this kind of system. In your book, Digital Tornado, which was a great kind of survey of technology trends by some phenomenal authors, your chapter on blockchain mentions the idea of governance by design. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept and maybe that as a process?
Yeah, absolutely. And this, as you noted, it ties it back to the larger debate about the internet. Digital Tornado was the title of a paper that I wrote when I was at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission in charge of internet policy in 1997. And it was talking about how the internet was going to transform telecommunications and business in general, and all of these thorny legal and regulatory issues that would have to get worked through as a result of it. Very similar. And so in 2017, I hosted a conference on the 20th anniversary of that paper. It was really one of the first government white papers looking at the potential of the internet and trying to address some of the policy issues it raised. And so I was able to get together a number of wonderful, fantastic scholars from around the world to ask the question about, well, what had happened in the intervening 20 years. And what we saw was essentially that what you alluded to earlier, this vision of the internet would basically make legal concerns go away, and would allow everything to be decentralized. The reality was the establishment and governments were in many cases able to exert control, and then this beautiful network that we saw also became a something that facilitated all kinds of harms, all kinds of problems, the manipulation and the abuses and the destruction of privacy and so forth that we've seen through social media and all of that. And so the book was looking at from the perspective of basically today, what do we do about that? And my argument in the chapter you talked about was that blockchain is the next stage. Blockchain is basically recreating this potential of the internet, but we have the same problem. We have this dream that it will be a self-organized, decentralized system, but that's not the reality that that's going to work. And so the argument that I make is that we need to think about governance. Governance is not government. Government is one mechanism of governance using the power of a state that has territory and the use of force and so forth. But governance is more broadly how organizations and entities make decisions, how they resolve conflicts, how they figure out what to do in difficult, complex situations. And that's always the challenge for blockchain systems. We've seen time and time again where blockchain networks have had to resolve these disputes. And typically they fall back on very ad hoc processes that essentially re-centralize, that essentially most of the time result in a small number of actors having disproportionate power. Well, so how do we get around that and avoid all of these catastrophes where the systems will fall apart if there's a hack or if there's a big dispute? And the point is, we need governance to be at every level of the system. The idea of governance by design is an analogy to privacy by design, which was first coined by Anne Cavoukian, who was the head of the privacy for, I think, the Ottawa region in Canada. And she pointed out that privacy can't just be something at the front end. You can't just say, well, let's have regulations and company practices about collection of data. Well, no, because you may have appropriate collection of data, but then the aggregation and manipulation of data, the transfer of data to third parties, the security over the data, all of that might be the problem. What we need organizations to do is think hard about privacy, have practices and policies and mechanisms about privacy through every stage of what they are doing with data. And that was subsequently incorporated as a key element of the European General Data Protection Regulation. And it's now really understood as a foundational idea for privacy. I think we need something similar for blockchain with governance, that we need entities that are building blockchain systems. And I say that in a very general way. That could be companies that are building blockchains. It could be companies building applications, decentralized applications based on smart contracts on top of the blockchain. It could be consortia, groups of companies that come together in some of these permission blockchain networks that are not fully decentralized, but are still decentralized in the sense that no one has absolute power. At every stage, all of those organizations need to be saying, all right, what are our governance mechanisms? Who has executive power? Who has legislative power? Who has judicial power to resolve disputes? And what does that look like? And then what happens if something goes wrong? So that's the governance by design approach. And one of the projects that I've been spearheading, something called the Crypto Governance Project at Wharton, where we brought together a group of blockchain experts from around the world. Actually, Chris was one of the people who was at our first meeting. And one thing that came out of that was the development of a questionnaire to identify the governance structures of different blockchain systems. so that we can compare oranges to oranges and apples to apples. And we are now going through and working with different projects to say, all right, fill this out and just describe what you're doing. And the fascinating thing is a number of them have said, wow, we never thought about this. Like we have governance, we thought we have governance, but we've really never analyzed what we are doing today. And there's actually cases where projects have said, well, we can't get back to you for 9 months. And I say, why can't you get back to us? Why not? Just describe your governance. They said, well, we looked at all these questions and we just couldn't answer them. And we realized we've got to revamp our governance. We have to be able to answer these questions. These are things we should be able to address. And these are not small projects that have said this. We're going to go back to square one and figure out what our governance is because we realize this is important.
Is it because I guess blockchain is coming out of the software engineering space, that some of these things are seen as kind of afterthoughts? In Digital Tornado, one of the analogies that you use is about the Siren song, which I love. Perhaps you can just explain to people what that is, but also, where does the role of kind of ethics and accountability come into these systems too?
Yeah, so the in Homer's Odyssey, the great classical Greek work, there's a scene where Odysseus or Ulysses it comes to these the area that's inhabited by what are called the Sirens, these kind of mermaids, and they sing this incredibly enticing song. And the problem is, if anyone hears the song, they are just so overwhelmed they have to go and hear what the sirens are singing, and they jump off of the boat and drown. And Odysseus wants to hear the song, but he doesn't want to drown. And so he tells his crew, he says, first of all, you should put wax in your ears so you don't hear the song. But I want to hear the song. So don't put wax in my ears, but tie me to the mast so that what's going to happen is I'm going to say, I want to jump in. And first of all, I can't. I can't jump in because I've tied myself to the mast. And second, you will not listen to me when I say, I am your captain. I order you to untie me because you can't hear me. You've got wax in your ears. So what Odysseus does, this is what's called a credible commitment, or kind of so called a commitment device, that he is prospectively disempowering himself and he is prospectively disempowering his crew. That when the moment comes, he does not have the ability to jump in and his crew do not have the ability to heed his orders and untie him. And that's kind of what blockchain does because of the underlying immutable nature of the ledger backed by the cryptography. Individual actors lack the power to reverse transactions. And that's a very valuable and powerful thing. But as we talked about, it's also a dangerous thing. So that's the analogy I make, and then I go through some of the problems that have happened with these blockchain networks that haven't thought through governance. So I think this is really the next frontier, and again we're seeing this. We are seeing many more organizations saying, "Gee, we really need to think about how our governance mechanisms work and surface them." One of the things, for example, in the Ethereum community, is that there's all kinds of governance, but most people don't really realize what it is. Even people who are spending every day, every waking moment thinking about Ethereum, they just sort of take it for granted. So part of what we need to do is bring this to the surface, and then part of what we need to do is compare notes and identify the trade-offs. It's the same thing that we need to do about the other two elements about law and regulation that I also talk about in the book.
Hey, Kevin, that's a really interesting way to describe it, and I wonder about your reflections. It strikes me that it does create new challenges that when we hand control over our private keys or even the ownership that we might have of goods to individuals or away from legal systems or corporate hierarchical systems, that creates interesting and complicated new problems. For example, if you want to reverse a transaction on a credit card, you can call your bank. If you want to reverse a transaction on Bitcoin, well, I mean, functionally you can't do it, but the alternative is you'd have to market your case to the entire Bitcoin community to roll back the ledger or something like that. In that sense, I think it's really important for us to remember that, these technologies of trust that we've built up over the last millennia, multi-millennia, have added value. How do you sort of see those that interaction between what we have previously expected from our technologies of trust to these new ones, these new decentralized models of trust.
That's a really important point. And the argument that I make is that law, regulation, and governance are not in opposition to blockchain technology and the kind of decentralized innovation that it represents. They are actually necessary to fully realize the potential of these technologies. And one perfect example is the one that you gave, that if basically a transition to using a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin means that you can be your own bank, which means you are responsible for information security and key management at the same level of security as established financial institutions have decades of experience and experts and spend millions of dollars on. If that's the case, then that's what we've seen already, which is time after time, where even though the Bitcoin network is secure, people's keys get stolen and get hacked in all sorts of ways, and funds get lost irreversibly. So that's not a good outcome. That's not a trusted outcome. So, the law as well as governance mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms are good and bad. I'm not saying that all law is beneficial and all traditional governmental legal mechanisms are better than other mechanisms. But the idea is if there is a problem, then we need ways of solving it. And so, in the example you gave, it's true technically that you can't, without forcing a majority of the miners or convincing them to fork the blockchain or to change their software, you can't reverse the transaction on the Bitcoin network. On the other hand, if the issue is there's a transaction on a Bitcoin network or some other cryptocurrency network, and I can go into a court somewhere and say that was a fraudulent transaction, and I can identify the counterparty that engaged in that fraudulent transaction. I can get a court order that says they owe me the money back. And if I can enforce that court order, it doesn't matter what the Bitcoin ledger says. Now, the point is, it's hard to do that potentially with some uses of cryptocurrencies. But when you think about it, there's this assumption that it's all or nothing, that if we have decentralized blockchain type networks that have what are considered immutable transactions, then automatically every party is anonymous, every transaction is global, legal enforcement mechanisms are totally ineffective. Well, that's not the case. The reality is, while there certainly are edge cases, individuals and organizations who value tremendously the ability to be anonymous and have transactions be completely irreversible, um, it's actually a fairly small set of cases, especially once you exclude the ones where the reasons people want to do that is because they're engaging in illegal transactions. They want to fund terrorists, or they want to engage in sex trafficking or other sorts of things, or money laundering. That's not all of what people are using cryptocurrencies for. But if we put that aside and say, well, the whole point of this is not to allow that, we do have some cases like people in authoritarian countries who need to circumvent governments and so forth. But those are relatively small in the grand scheme of things. If we're talking about substituting for traditional finance, we're talking about trillions of dollars right now that are every month really flowing through these transactional networks. If we're talking about that, the entities, and I'm not just talking about the big institutional traditional entities. I'm talking about the major entities that want to benefit from this. They want a system where if something goes wrong, there's recourse. And so they are going to want a system that is legally compliant. But we have room to debate what that system looked like, and where some of the traditional laws may go too far and so forth. There's certainly, that's important to do. But the point is, we need law and regulation and governance as a backstop, along with what blockchain and cryptocurrencies add, which is the value of enforcement through code, through the underlying cryptography.
I mean, so that's an interesting thing. And as you were talking, there's a genre of thinking about the internet and digital technologies as as seeding its own ground, a place where the state doesn't exist. That's a genre that's not so popular anymore, but it was very popular in the 1990s and even early 2000s. And I know you've written a lot about that. But now that has been fairly roundly rejected. We know that the state governments, jurisdictions play a really important role in shaping the digital realm, in determining what can be done on and off the internet. But I wonder how you reflect with that vision that you have, or your understanding of the interaction between law and blockchain. With how do you reflect on? So, for instance, I've got right up in front of me the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto, the famous Timothy C. May manifesto, where he argued that cryptography and these digital technologies provided an alternative, almost realm for human interaction that was separate to big government and big corporations. Do you still see that that sort of vision is viable, or is there something left there, or do we have to accept that the law and the blockchain are just going to be so deeply intertwined? It's just yet another space for political economy contests.
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I actually think law having a role is a good thing. Keeps people like me having a job, and people like you having a job. But no, in all seriousness, so there is tremendous beauty and tremendous value to having aspirations about greater human freedom through the use of technology. I'm all for that. But when you think about it, if the vision is that law and government go away, and all that matters is code, is the software. Well, then basically, ultimately, what that's saying is all that matters is power. So if I can crack the encryption, then I win. If I can't crack the encryption, but let's say maybe I can drag enough people off to prison in the dark of night and threaten to torture their families and get them to give up their private keys, then I win. And so that world where we don't have the protections of democratically enacted laws and the space to debate what's appropriate regulation, and the space to figure out what are the limits of governance, how do we create systems that limit the abuse of the system for evil and illicit uses without putting too much of a roadblock on the beneficial uses. If that's not the debate that we're having, then the places that win are places like China. Because China can create a system that is totally controlled and can dampen down very substantially the systems that are out of its control. And the places elsewhere don't have a lot to fall back on, again, because the majority of the users are going to say, I don't want to use this for illicit activity. I want to use it in a trusted way. I want to use it where I'm comfortable that there is recourse if we have a dispute. There is some protection against fraud, and so forth. And so, yeah, again, I don't think it's that, there are, people who have some of these kind of extreme cyber libertarian views who just don't care about, those kinds of concerns. But I think, most of the people for whom things like crypto anarchism is appealing, they feel that way because they see the flaws of governments, which are very real, and they long for more user and individual control. And I think that's wonderful. But that again, the problem is thinking that it's one or the other. The reality is everything has trade-offs. No system is perfect. And so we need to understand the trade-offs. And I think that's frankly what we've seen. That there was the argument that Bitcoin would just take over all of payments because everyone would just have so much of a desire to use this kind of system. Hasn't happened, right? Virtually no one, to a first approximation, uses Bitcoin as a payment mechanism, except again in some of these relatively small cases, some of which are illicit and some of which are people trying to avoid totalitarian regimes. People are using it for lots of different things. They're seeing it, for example, as digital gold, as a store of value hedge, and so forth. But the reality is, ideology alone, while there are people for whom that's the basis of decisions that they make, most people, they want the system that works best for them. And so I'd much rather figure out how to bridge between what law does well, regulation does well, what governance does well, how to manifest those things through code in a decentralized way, as opposed to drawing these bright lines.
I think one of the big challenges there is that in the blockchain space, a lot of companies, a lot of communities have felt that governance is something that is an add on, that you can have governance or not have governance. So they've interpreted the say 2017, 16, 15 Bitcoin governance crisis as, well, Bitcoin didn't have governance. So therefore it had that issue. And what we have to do is we have to build a governance model or module on top of what we're doing, or go the other extreme, which is, construct a governance first model like EOS or Decred or something like that. But the observation that I know we've made to many of the firms that we work with at RMIT is that regardless of whether you think you've got a governance approach, you have governance. Governance exists in your system. It may be unexamined. It may be entirely implicit. It may be entirely centralized in the founder. But every blockchain has governance of some description, and the question is, can you design that? Or can you be smarter about it? And can you make a governance system or structure a governance system that brings a community on board or heads you towards the decentralization that you seek, or whatever margin that you care about? It's interesting to hear people claim that there isn't governance as they constantly tweet or hop on forums or engage in conferences arguing that, this is a governance minimalization strategy. But to what extent do you think that, like a lot of the trustlessness, governance itself is also a risk? So if I take the perspective of a company designing let's just say it's a layer one blockchain, or a founder or a coder or whatever, and then I hand it off to a community that might take it in a direction that I didn't visualize or I may even object to. So to some extent, the idea of governance, or at least decentralized governance, if that is your goal, is actually presents a risk to the original designers of the chain, and potentially a risk to the value that they believe that they've created.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I will say is risk is not always a bad thing. In fact, risk is the foundation of finance. And it also is at the heart of trust. So this is the surprising thing I talk about in my book, the blockchain and the new architecture of trust. What is trust? Trust is not certainty, right? If I hold a gun to your head and say, I want you to do something, I'm certain you're going to do it. It's not because I trust you. In fact, it's because I don't trust you that I've got to use the gun. Trust is the idea of confidence merged with uncertainty. And so I'm confident, even though there's still some risk. And so what we want are systems that are trustworthy. We don't want systems that have no risk. But we need to understand, first of all, why we should be confident. And we need to understand what risks we're taking. And different communities will take different kinds of risks. Again, if I want to get together a group of insurance companies and build a decentralized system for insurance on a blockchain, my sense of risk and my sense of what the limitations are on that system, what it can be taken and used for outside of my initial scope, is going to be very different than if I'm building a general purpose smart contract world computer system. But even if I'm doing the latter, I should not want that to be a system which is designed and used predominantly to facilitate child sex trafficking, right? That's not a use that I should want. And if I am totally comfortable personally with that, then we, society, should say, no, we draw a line to say there are some things that are not legitimate. And then we start with the really easy cases like that. And then we work through the harder cases. And we're seeing this now with, for example, decentralized finance applications, where there's again tremendous potential, tremendous good, lots of innovation, efficiencies of creating new financial instruments, but also lots of bad, lots of new kinds of risk, lots of opportunities for fraud, lots of opportunities for systemic risk, and so forth. And we are starting to define where the lines are. And again, there's not going to be one line. It's not that there is some entity that appropriately can and will say this is an appropriate level of risk. And we bring governments back in. Different governments will have different views about that. That's okay. The world is decentralized and polycentric, and frankly has been for a long time, much before all this technology. We shouldn't be afraid of that debate, and we'll come out in a different place. I'm not saying that everything just falls back to the existing traditional power centers and the territorial governments, but those are just examples of this process that is always going to happen. You don't want to get away from.
And to some extent, the challenge is not as hard as it's sometimes presented, as if there's this world where there can be no control by government. Because I like to think about the on ramps and the off ramps of the blockchain space. So yes, it can be very challenging, as you pointed out earlier. It can be very challenging to prevent a rollback of funds as it's transferred through the Bitcoin blockchain itself. But if you can identify who the person is that made the transfer, then you can take them to court. If you can identify an exchange that they might have interacted with, it's those on ramps and off ramps, the difference, the jump between the digital world, the digital blockchain world, and the terrestrial world that we all live in. And if you recognize that we are inevitably controlled by law, the law of our own domestic countries and subnational jurisdictions, then it's less of a problem than it initially seemed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. And it's ironic in a way, because when you think about cryptocurrency and you go back to Bitcoin, everyone who is in this world appreciates that Bitcoin was a kind of miracle, that all of the underlying technologies were there before. The idea of what we now call a blockchain, the various cryptographic primitives, the idea of something like all of that existed, and Satoshi was very clear in citing to those things. But Bitcoin somehow got it right because of the way it was designed. There were a whole set of design decisions that made it succeed, whereas previous attempts to create digital cash failed. So it's not that just having the general idea makes it work. And then what's happened subsequently? Well, Ethereum came up with something different. Bitcoin doesn't have Turing complete smart contracts that allow you to write any kind of program on Bitcoin. Other networks have made other trade-offs that give better throughput and better performance and so forth. Those are design decisions. Everyone that is building something on blockchain is entirely focused on a complex set of design decisions to make these systems work. So why isn't governance the same? Why do we just assume that governance is something that you don't need to think about? It just happens or it just doesn't happen. No, it deserves at least as much attention as the technical decisions about the underlying infrastructure. And this is, we're having a debate now in the United States about crypto regulation, where some of the regulators are apparently mulling a proposal for what are called unhosted or self-hosted wallets. We have a wallet that the key is not in the control of a third party. It's the user has their own key, or it might be actually not even a person. This might be a wallet for some sort of decentralized finance system where it's basically just a smart contract. And the proposal is that if you are a regulated entity like an exchange, Coinbase being the biggest one in the US, that's a centralized entity, right? Coinbase holds the keys for most of its users. If you are doing business with one of these self-hosted wallets, you need to figure out who is essentially the beneficial owner. You've got to get information about where the money is going or coming from to prevent money laundering. And Coinbase and other crypto companies have been up in arms about this. Is that we can't figure this out. It's decentralized. And the issue is, well, wait a minute. Why is Coinbase so big? Why does Coinbase exist? Coinbase exists because it makes it really easy for people to transact with crypto. And they do that by having their own control as a centralized exchange over people's keys and over the matching process of an exchange. And they create a great experience around it and a safe, secure experience. But if you want to get the benefits of that, the benefits of trust in third parties, then you can't assume that you also perfectly have the benefits of a totally decentralized system where everyone gets to be their own bank. Again, that's why Coinbase is a big company and everyone is not just holding their own Bitcoin keys and transacting in Bitcoin the way Satoshi Nakamoto proposed it in 2008. And so again, there has to be a balance here. And I don't think that should be a fundamentally scary thing. I think it's very legitimate for advocates of crypto to say we can and should move that balance more in this direction of user empowerment than we have had historically because of the capabilities of the technology. Absolutely. But again, governments don't exist to hurt people and to exert all of their power. At least most governments that I've encountered, they exist for collective goals. And again, we should have that debate. And in the end, the systems that will be successful, if we are thinking about blockchain networks that are going to have millions and billions of users and doing billions and trillions of dollars of transaction, which I fully expect we will, then those are going to be systems that have to interface with governments and have to interface even with private actors who are asking the question, where should the boundaries be? And where do we make trade-offs in terms of ease of use for end users, for most end users, vis-a-vis more control? And where do we make trade-offs in terms of systemic risk and so forth?
I've traveled a lot in China around and visited a number of blockchain companies, and that's absolutely right. But it does strike me that there's almost a parallel blockchain industry in China, one that doesn't deeply interact with the blockchain industry that we're more used to. Innovations happening in parallel rather than collaboratively, and it to the extent that there's a balkanization of the internet as a result of geopolitical changes, I wonder to what extent it will there and is there a balkanization of the blockchain industry, this utopian vision that we've all signed up to in some way and on some margin.
Oh yeah, it's the same old story. It's exactly, as people like me who were in the U.S. government 20 years ago were supremely confident that there's no way China could not join the internet and open up, right? Because there's no way you could build a something like a great firewall, ha ha ha, that would cause the packets to stop at the border. And guess what they did? And not just them. And we should understand what that means. Now, on the other hand, there's lots of interoperability and there's lots of interaction and interdependence. Same thing with blockchain. But a lot of what China is doing is not just the regulation, but is also the stimulus. They are saying we believe this technology is the future. It's part of what they call new infrastructure. Is one of the foundational technologies for the 21st century. That they are making deep commitments to. And they are telling the private sector and local governments, you should figure out where can you use blockchain? Where is there potential of cryptocurrencies to facilitate transactions and systems? And that's stimulating a lot of activity. You're absolutely right. It's not necessarily that it is cut off. It's just that there don't exist these opportunities in the West because governments haven't been aggressive in the same way in promoting it. So look, you can also go too far in saying what's happening in China is totally different and cut off from what's happening elsewhere. There's lots of passage back and forth, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that in the United States with the new administration we have that we will step back from some of these really counterproductive efforts to say we were just trying to cut that off and not have, for example, Chinese students come here and so forth. We need those lines of communication, which are happening. But yeah, we need to ask the question if there is an attempt to create systems that are hermetically sealed, that don't have the kind of openness and protection for individual rights that most of the rest of the world believes in. Well, then we need to create a coalition of the willing of everyone else and to say, let's bring together the different communities outside of China that are building blockchain systems and say to China, we want you to participate, but you have to understand, the need for openness. And then let's debate where the lines are. Of course, we don't want a system that has no recourse for crime. But we also believe that financial privacy is important and that there's tremendous value in having some room for individuals to have control. And again, let's define what that is. It's a microcosm of the debate that we that is happening in parts of the world that I think America will now rejoin. Which is defining, what are the ideals that we have, and what are the, the governance and kind of meta governance standards that we want to achieve.
What policy risks do you see from here, and conversely, what are you excited by from that public policy side?
So there's a number of projects that I lead. One that started in 2017 is called the Reg Ed Tech Roundtables, where we bring together regulators from around the world who work on cryptocurrency types of issues, along with academics and key industry figures. What shocked us when we first put this together was, the regulators really valued having these kinds of informal opportunities to engage with the people in the industry and vice versa. But frankly, the regulators were thrilled to talk to each other. Even in the United States, we have 6 different financial regulators that deal with blockchain and cryptocurrencies, and they don't talk to each other. That's something that we've done for a number of years. It's been on hold during the pandemic because so much of the value is the informal personal interactions that you really can't quite get on Zoom. But that's one project. There's also this crypto governance project that I talked about, that's focused on governance. And then there's a project that I've been working on over the last year or so with the World Economic Forum, where we are developing what's called a toolkit for policymakers on decentralized finance, or DeFi as it's called. These applications that build financial instruments in a programmable and composable way on blockchain. You can start with a stable coin, some algorithmic system that creates a token that keeps its value, and build upon that, say, a lending interface, and then build upon that a derivatives interface, and so forth. And all those systems can interoperate, and they're all based on blockchain systems, potentially much more efficient, potentially tremendous financial inclusion benefits, and so forth, vis-a-vis the traditional centralized mode of finance, but big regulatory questions. How to deal with issues of fraud, how to deal with issues of money laundering, how to deal with risk issues. We've seen a lot of cases where these things are hacked, or we've seen cases where there are exploits, or seen cases where there's surprising interactions between the different components that then create new kinds of risk that haven't been anticipated. Very much like what we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis, where no one quite realized the interaction of these different systems. So we are trying to build a framework for policymakers, not saying what the answers are, but helping them understand the questions. We've gotten a lot of feedback from policymakers around the world saying, we know this is an issue, we know this is going to be a challenge, we don't even know what questions to ask. What are the risks we should be concerned about? And what does the community and the industry look like today, so we can understand what to do? So that's another project I've been working on a lot. You mentioned China, and China is fascinating. It is in many ways the world's most advanced country in terms of the way that it is exploring the potential of blockchain technology. There's a whole variety of different experiments going on in China around blockchain. There's one that doesn't get enough attention elsewhere, called the Blockchain Service Network, which is kind of an interoperability and development network that wraps around different blockchains. But the one that's gotten the most attention is the central bank digital currency, what they call DCEP, where they are basically digitizing the RMB, the Chinese currency. It's not really a blockchain that is decentralized in the way a public network like Bitcoin or Ethereum is, but it uses many of the similar concepts. You probably could call it a distributed ledger. And the idea is basically taking money, and not just privately, but the money that is issued by fiat, by the state, managed by the central bank, and applying a lot of these blockchain concepts to it. And that's potentially transformative. That is the future of money. Every nation is eventually going to do something like this. And China is one of the countries that's out front. It's fascinating and exciting to watch, but it opens up all these questions, because China is going to make a set of decisions about financial surveillance that liberal democracies are not going to make. And China is going to make a whole set of other decisions that we might not be comfortable with, and we might not be comfortable with the RMB being the spearhead that countries and private companies around the world look to when they want to have the advantages of a potentially global distributed digital currency. So it's really incumbent upon the rest of the world to look at what's happening in China, not to reject it, but to appreciate the good and the bad of what they're doing, and to see that as a spur to themselves exploring this. And let me say, it's not that China is building something that is inherently evil or inherently creates surveillance at every point. They are, for example, pushing forward on some really interesting work on what they call controllable anonymity. So, this digital currency in China will work like cash for small value transactions, in that when you transact with a merchant, the merchant will not know who you are. You will be totally anonymous, and that will be cryptographically protected like cash. Not by the way, like the way the vast majority of retail transactions happen now in China, which is through mobile payments, through Alipay or WeChat Pay, where that intermediary and the counterparty gets lots of information about what you're doing. It will actually be more private at that level, but there will be backdoors for the central bank to exercise for surveillance and for other regulators and law enforcement to get access to transactions. We don't know exactly, again, how that's going to be designed, and I suspect it will be designed in China in a way that we in countries like the United States and Australia will make different choices. But we got to make those choices, and we've got to have those choices out in the open if we're going to have a competitive system. So,
You've done this transition a little bit already for us, but you've been involved in internet policy and telecommunications policy since at least the 1990s, as I know. And we're at the. I'd be interested in your reflection on what you expect from the Biden administration in January, and additionally how you would assess the Trump administration on the specific area of blockchain and cryptocurrency.
so there really is no Trump administration. There are a whole bunch of people doing things. Many of them are doing the best they can at the staff level, and then there's a Twitter account. And so, there's a lot of good that has happened. I have good friends in the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they have worked really hard to deal with securities fraud, with initial coin offerings, and trying to work with industry and so forth. They just elevated what's called FinHub, which is the SEC office that focuses on cryptocurrencies. They just elevated it to be a standalone office within the SEC, which is a wonderful thing. But they have limits to what they can do. There is no coordination across the government. There is no one standing up and saying this is a strategic technology. Look, China gets this. Europe gets this. The European Union has done a tremendous amount with its blockchain observatory and other work. Other countries around the world recognize that this is something where we need to get everyone together across the government and across the private sector. And the Trump administration was allergic to that. So you had some positive developments, and then you had also some statements coming out of the Treasury Department saying cryptocurrencies are terrible and we need to shut them down and stop them. And lots of disconnection and dysfunction, which is basically what we saw overall with this administration. Biden administration will be very different. Like the Obama administration, it has a lot of very smart, very experienced people who believe in working together, who believe that there is tremendous convening power of the White House, even when it's not regulating, that it can elevate issues and it can elevate them on the international stage. And I think you will see more humility from the U.S. that we no longer can drive the world the way that we maybe did in the past, rightly or wrongly. This is something where there needs to be a lot of global collaboration. Um, and there's frankly a lot of agreement at a broad level, both internally between the different political factions in the U.S. and globally on what the starting points are. So I think you'll see a lot of that. But there's different viewpoints, and there are some who are scared about the potential abuses of these technologies. We see a lot of debate about Facebook's Libra, now DM project, and stablecoins. There was a proposal just put out from some Democratic Congress members about requiring any stablecoin issuer to get a banking license. So, while I think the notion behind that there needs to be regulation if you're at large scale, essentially taking deposits, the framing of that is incredibly broad, and I think problematic. But a lot will depend on who exactly are in the key policy offices. There are a number of very experienced people that I know and trust who have a great understanding of cryptocurrencies, who are in the mix and who are involved right now in the transition process for Biden. Will know in maybe 6 9 months or so who is in a position to really drive the agenda. I think to a large extent there will be broad agreement, but we will see different shades based on the way that that all comes out.
Really interesting. We've talked about some of the government approaches to blockchain, such as China, as well as the kind of corporate approaches, I guess, where Libra has sort of picked up the slack, the opportunity there. I'm interested to hear your perspective on the role of people as kind of users in these systems, and also if you have any opinions on automation and how that kind of intersection between blockchain and automation might play out.
Users are tremendously important, and again, this is when you look at what are people actually doing. Again, almost no one, to a first approximation, is using cryptocurrencies for basic transactions. Now, almost no one is not no one, and in certain categories, in certain societies where there are problems with the existing financial system, it's not a tiny number, but it's certainly not by any means the dominant approach. There's a lot of interesting experimentation around decentralized finance and some of these token-based systems, but again, it's really tiny when you look at it. And then there's people speculating on coins. There's people buying and selling Bitcoin and so forth to make money on appreciation of the token. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's financial speculation. Where you want to compare it to, how much are people speculating on stocks, for example, around the world, which is thousands and thousands of times greater. Um, if there is significant user adoption of any of these systems, that will be a game changer. And again, we've seen little bits and pieces of CryptoKitties and stuff, but things like non-fungible tokens, like those CryptoKitties, if there is something that really does have significant adoption, which again is not just about the novelty of it, but is about it solving real problems for people, then that really will be transformative, because that's what frankly has not happened yet. We had a tremendous amount of fascinating technology development and growth of a new investment asset class at scale, but nothing else is really big enough to matter. So users matter. If users actually change their behavior, that's what will tip the market. In terms of automation, yeah, absolutely. I mean, smart contracts, the possibility for automation is at the core of both the potential benefits and the potential dangers, because it's those automated smart contracts which magnify risks and make things go wrong. So yeah, I think that one of the great challenges that we face around the world is the question of regulation of algorithms and regulation by algorithms. Is broadly speaking, automated, software-defined, data-driven systems, understanding how they regulate behavior by private companies and by government, and how to exercise oversight over them because they're exploding in usage and we need to wrestle with it. And again, to go back to China, to me, and some of the other work I've done, I've looked at the social credit system in China, not a blockchain-based system, but this overarching set of systems that are about monitoring and integrating data and providing feedback and incentives around behavior in all kinds of areas. It's something that many people outside of China just get freaked out about and think, oh my God, this is this horrible Black Mirror kind of dystopia. Take another look, because so much of what is happening in China is about figuring out how to build governance mechanisms for those kinds of systems. Now, in China, given that free speech doesn't exist in China in the way it does in other places, and you can be thrown in jail for criticizing the government, this system will be used to enforce that law as well as the other laws protecting things in China, and that's problematic. But the problem is not with the idea and the implementation of what China is doing in trying to figure out how do we put guardrails around these automated systems. Automate, use them to be more efficient in implementing law and legal compliance. That's the huge potential. But also integrate oversight, watch the watchers at the same time. So again, I think we should study what they're doing and build better systems and more comprehensive systems in the West. But that's really, frankly, the grand governance challenge of the world for the next 50 years or so.
I was just going to say, you're doing some really interesting work at the moment with various governments or kind of like multilateral organizations. It'd be fascinating to hear you talk a little bit more about where the thinking is at towards blockchain or decentralized technologies. You also mentioned China before, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on central bank digital currencies on that thread as well.
Well, again, I'm excited about bringing the community together because I think most of the private sector and the academic community and the researchers, are now at the point where they are more open to having that discussion than maybe they were before, just because of what we've seen with the development of these networks and systems. They want to build things that are scalable and influential and important. And so, I think we will see a lot more of these conversations where it's not just, again, out of nowhere, some statement by the Treasury Secretary that, Bitcoin is terrible and it's all fraudulent. You will have, a lot of opportunities for consultation. You will have efforts towards legislation. You will have, with China, efforts, first of all, to very seriously push back and say, we in the United States and we in the liberal democratic world believe that certain values are essential, and that those should not be traded off. But also reaching out to China, also saying, all right, let's figure out where there are opportunities for collaboration. Where we agree that this is a foundational technology and it's a global technology, right? China gets that the digital yuan, this DCPP, is not magically going to be adopted around the world, and it's going to need to interface with other governments. They're seeing this, for example, with that blockchain service network, where frankly they got pushback in China from the major state-owned enterprises to integrating with decentralized public blockchains. So they actually split the network where they've got a China network and a global network. And so, there's going to be a lot of that back and forth. I think and hope that what we will see coming out of the U.S. administration are people saying, look, um, if what we are talking about here is innovation, what we're talking about here is financial inclusion, what we're talking about here is greater innovation in new financial services, great. Let's promote it. And so let's figure out what are the systems that are doing that, with an understanding that we're concerned about fraud. We're concerned about systemic risk. We're concerned about financial crimes and money laundering. We're concerned about terrorist financing, all those things. Work with us to deal with those things. You should be concerned about that as well. And I think more of an effort to clearly draw those lines, to say, all right, here's the difference between being a good actor and a bad actor. And this is frankly what, from the meetings that I've been in for years, industry is clamoring for this, is saying, for the most part, tell us what we need to do, because we agree there are abusive, bad actors out there, and you should prosecute them, go after them, throw the book at them. And so I think you'll see more of the U.S. Trying to send those signals, that will create more of a split, and I think that's a healthy thing.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And I think we do need to do a follow-up at some point, because I'm sure there's plenty more that we could cover. But we will wrap you up here for today. So thank you so much to our guests, Kevin Werbach, and of course Chris Berg from RMIT. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Mint and Burn. You can check out the show notes and get in touch if you have ideas or feedback on the podcast. If you're interested in more information and further research, do visit rmitblockchain.io. Thank you so much to you both.